All right. So I want to talk a little bit about how you should manipulate your independent variable as well as how you should measure your dependent variable. And I know we've already talked quite a bit about measurements the last week, but this will kind of complement some of that information. So manipulating your independent variable, for the most part, I think all of your manipulations should fall in this kind of straightforward category where you're either giving participants some kind of different instructions or framing your task in a different way or giving them some kind of different stimulus, like, from a different, something from one or the other news agency or one or the other video or having people under time pressure or not or something like that. So there are a lot of very straightforward manipulations where you just design these two different conditions, at least two different conditions, and you're just exposing people to them. Other times there might be things that are staged manipulations instead, where you have people that are in on the study, for example, like they are acting as though they're another participant or as though they're a bystander, and they're acting in some way. This might be useful in things like pro-social behavior or conformity research, where you want someone to pretend that they're hurt, or you want a bunch of people to pretend that they believe something that's wrong to see if somebody else will go along with them. When there's deception involved, of course, we need to be very careful to respect participants' autonomy and their, whether or not they want to be involved in a study, and be very careful about debriefing them afterwards, which we'll talk a little bit about in week 5 as well. So there are things that are sort of staged, things like that. You also, part of the reason you might do these stage things is because in a lab or reading some instructions, you can't make anyone feel stressed, or you can't make anyone, feel like there's a real social interaction from reading a passage about somebody, right? So you might need to be making some event as real as possible under the very unrealistic limitations that an experimental study gives you. These people that I've mentioned before that might be in on the study, these are generally called confederates. Someone who's in on it, someone who's acting, someone who's playing a part. Again, like I said, either a participant or a bystander most of the time. So it might seem kind of straightforward, for the most part, how you're going to manipulate an independent variable until you actually start thinking about what is going to be in those conditions. Um, because you don't always know how strongly you need to manipulate a variable. There isn't a an objective, like, level of high stress or low stress or hard or easy math test, in the same way that it's not like exactly 90 degrees means it's hot outside and exactly 30 means it's cold, right? It's different at different times to different people, and you need to figure out what level of your variable is actually appropriate for your research question. Usually you're going to start out with two levels. Sometimes maybe you would have three because you want to do like high stress, low stress, or absence of stress, or high attractiveness, low attractiveness, and like not having a picture or something in some particular study. But how do you actually pick, again, what levels to choose of your independent variable? I think most people's first instinct, most researchers' first instinct, is to try to compare either the absence, like a control condition, or the weakest version of an independent variable to the strongest version. Because remember, in experiments, our first job is not to necessarily be as realistic as possible. It's just to show that something is possible at all, to show that some effect can be observed. And then from there, you might be much more subtle with how you manipulate things. If you're trying to see, okay, we know if we give people 1 minute to do 40 math questions, that's stressful and it makes them react in this way. What if we gave them 20 minutes to do 40 instead? Is that still going to be stressful enough to change um, the outcomes for them? Uh, in a lot of ways, though, the strongest manipulation that you can think of might be too unrealistic to actually do, though, right? So let's say you want to study like people's frustration, and you bring them into the lab and you're doing a bunch of things that aren't allowing them to reach their goal of like completing a a computer task or something. Maybe you have a computer that is mocked up to not let them finish the task, and that can be very frustrating. Like it keeps giving them errors and they're not able to do it. Well, it might be that eventually participants don't believe that it's actually happening that way, and they start being suspicious that it is actually the computer's fault. So that might be one way that a strong manipulation goes bad, or it might be the case that you are trying to, let's say, manipulate fear. Maybe in their everyday lives, the way people react to fear, it's not really that high of a level of fear. And you try to really, really scare people, like be afraid for their lives. That would probably be unethical, but you can imagine a researcher thinking about doing this. But maybe that's not realistic. Maybe people don't get that afraid that often, so it's not actually that interesting or useful to study people when they're terrified, for at least for a given research question. So you want to have a big difference between your weak manipulation or your control condition um, and the strongest condition. You want to be able to observe some kind of difference, but you don't want to make the IV strong category or condition so strong that it's like nonsense, right? And in some scenarios where if you're getting people too stressed out or too afraid, it could actually be dangerous for them. Physiologically, stress is very hard on our bodies. It could be bad for that reason. It could make people act irrationally or in a way that you can't predict. So it might be dangerous for other people involved in the study too. Okay, so measuring the dependent variable is another choice you have to make when you are conducting an experiment. You don't get to manipulate this one, but you need to assess this outcome in some way. And I just want to talk about a few different versions or possibilities that we have here. Sorry, my phone went off. Trying to coordinate things with kindergarten, always a lot of fun. So one version of this might be self-report. Very familiar with this, obviously. It's just answering questions. So that might be one way that's easy and economical to measure your dependent variable, but it might not be terribly realistic. People's mood isn't something that they're always reflecting on, or their level of stress, or their level of racism. So asking people about it, although it might seem very straightforward and normal to assess it in this way, it might be kind of artificial, and people might lie about it. People don't honestly want to say if they're in a bad mood or if they don't like people of a particular race, right? So that can make it very difficult to measure these things accurately via self-report. An alternative to self-report might be actually looking at people's behaviors. So instead of saying like, hey, are you in a good mood, you might say, count how many times the person is going to smile, or count how much they laugh at jokes, count how friendly they are in their speech patterns or something like that. That might be a really realistic way to do that. It's going to be much, much more expensive and time consuming to do that compared to self-report, but it might be a much, much better measure of what that dependent variable is, whatever it happens to be. A lot of studies might use reaction times or how long someone engages in a behavior too. There are lots of different things you can do with behavioral studies. You might also, for some dependent variables, be interested in physiological outcomes like galvanic skin response or electroencephalograms. There might be different things that matter for that, like galvanic skin response basically is measuring the level of moisture on your skin and the conductivity because of that moisture. So it gets to things just like general emotional arousal, but you can't necessarily say like what emotion that is. And MRIs, like, it might be really useful to do an fMRI, look at people's brain activity. But, for a lot of things, we don't necessarily know exactly what types of patterns of activity mean. So it might not be worth your time to, jump right into a neuroimaging study if you're just starting to really dive into a particular topic. Some other things that, maybe you can't look at behaviorally, or you don't trust people to tell you in self-report, things like implicit attitudes, the unconscious associations that people have between different things that we can use computer tasks to measure, like it's often the case that people aren't going to tell you what races and religions and genders and sexual orientations they don't like, but we can measure those things with an implicit attitudes test to see the strength of associations between different categories and positive and negative words. And these tend to be very useful measures for that sense. So just wanted to mention an alternative. The last thing I have on here is that you can use multiple measures of a DV. And this is often going to be your best bet, because think about doing a study and you've only used one type of DV. What if it doesn't work? Is it because your measure was bad, or is it because the effect you predicted is wrong? It can be really useful to include multiple measures on a given study, and then you not only are giving yourself more chances to see if you were right and have a better understanding of when and why you were right or wrong, you're engaging in your own replication. So for example, I did a study where I wanted to see people's anxiety during political conversations, and I asked them to tell me how anxious they felt afterwards. I recorded the conversations so I could code behaviors like blinking and how close they were, how much eye contact they were making, how open their body posture was. And I measured their cortisol concentrations in their saliva, having them spit into little tubes and then sending it off to a lab to see how much of that stress hormone cortisol was present in their spit before and after political conversations. So that was a way that I wanted to look at anxiety in a bunch of different ways. And it gave me more confidence about the effects that I was observing by having all these different indicators of anxiety that complement one another. One thing I want to mention here is that sometimes this happens where people measure a DV in a bunch of different ways and they only report the one that works. That is lying. That is saying, taking 3 shots and only telling people about one of them, the one that you made, right? So if you're going to design a study with multiple measures, you need to report all of the measures that you took in a study. And that's one of the things we'll get back to when we talk about questionable research practices and the problems with the incentives in research and science later on in the semester. Okay. Some things you might want to be careful about too when you're thinking about your DV is just how sensitive your measurement scale is. Think back to talking about a nominal versus a ratio type scale, right? They both have different levels of sensitivity and specificity. So if you're looking at is someone happy or not, think about the difference between just asking them, are you happy, yes or no, or having them rate it, right? You're going to get some different distributions and answers if you just have a yes or no response versus a not at all to very much type of scale, right? If you only measure yes or no, you might have a worse chance in some cases of measuring or of observing an effect, because the scale gives you more variability with which to measure that effect. But you also get the problem of people just wanting to put the middle option on scales. So if you make people choose between yes or no, there might be cases where that is a better way of doing it. Another couple things I want to mention is kind of calibrating your test, so it's not what we call a ceiling effect or a floor effect. If your test is too easy, you're going to have a bunch of scores near perfect, right? And then you're not going to be able to tell the variability there. Or if your behavior is really, really common, you might not really see much of a difference in those scores. On the other hand, if your task is impossible, then you're not going to be able to differentiate between people because everyone will have struggled and done poorly. So you need to kind of make sure things are in the middle if you're doing some kind of performance or assessment. You don't want to make it too easy and have all the scores cluster at the top end of the distribution, and you don't want to make it too hard and have all the scores cluster out over at the negative end of the distribution. I'm going to stop before I move on to the last part that I'll save for next week. So I'll end there with talking about variables, but just know that these are all very general ways of talking about manipulating and measuring IVs and DVs respectively, and all of your projects are going to have very specific decisions that you have to make, and I'm happy to talk about any of those decisions with you so you can try to make the best project that you can to have an interesting paper to write about.